Ukraine has just retreated and they're going to encircle Russian forces and they don't really control. What is the truth? What is actually happening in Bakhmut, and what is the significance of it?
Well, listen, you're asking the right questions, and Americans need to know the answers. I think the first thing we need to keep in mind is that Bakhmut was probably the most successful trap ever created in military history. Ultimately, the Russians managed to turn Bakhmut into the graveyard of the Ukrainian army. At least 50,000 Ukrainian soldiers were killed and many more were wounded. It has been nothing but a complete disaster. Zelensky obsessed over Bakhmut the way Hitler obsessed over Stalingrad. And the Ukrainians have had to pay a terrible price. And if you want to know just how profound the impact of this loss is, you need to look at Politico's article over the weekend about the desire of people in the White House inside the Biden administration to press for a so-called frozen conflict in Ukraine. I mean, it's abundantly clear to them that the myth of Ukrainian victory is just that. It's a myth. There's no chance whatsoever. In fact, the Ukrainians are on the road to total defeat and collapse. And what they've done is said, well, you know, we can't win, so we'll try to turn Ukraine into a European version of the Korean Peninsula. We'll split it. We'll freeze the conflict. We'll move U.S. forces into Western Ukraine, and then we'll just sit across from the Russians for another 50, 60, 70 years. Of course, this won't work, Charlie, because the Russians have no incentive to cooperate with that. The Russians are waiting for one more burst of energy out of the Ukrainians, which they will annihilate, another massive offensive that goes nowhere. And then I think they're going to move to take Odessa and Kharkov. But the truth is that Bakhmut was a catastrophe, and everyone knows it. People know the Ukrainians can't win. Now we're acting desperately at every turn. Send them F-16, send them whatever we have. Truth is, none of that's going to make any difference. The real danger in the future is that once it becomes clear that Ukraine has collapsed and the Russians are overrunning the two areas that I just mentioned, which are historically Russian, I fear that fools in Washington will talk about direct intervention by U.S., Polish, Romanian, maybe some British forces to somehow or another rescue the situation. That would put us at war with Russia, and we're not prepared for it.
I mean, that is definitely the disaster to be feared. And you read the Western media. I mean, you have it right here in the New York Times and all over the Wall Street Journal. You know, it says that Ukraine let this happen, and then they're trying to go back into Bakhmut. So, but let's talk more about this from an American perspective. I had a dialogue recently with a lawmaker who's very pro this war, and he's like, well, we have to fight to the bitter end for the liberation of Ukraine. And I said, well, how do you define Ukraine? He said, oh, including Crimea. I mean, can you just walk our audience through, Colonel, how irresponsible, how reckless that is? I don't think most Americans comprehend how cataclysmic some of their lawmakers are thinking on these topics.
Well, Washington is characterized by a unique combination of arrogance and ignorance. The people talking in Washington, the vast majority of them know absolutely nothing about Eastern Europe, let alone Russia and Ukraine. The problem is that in 2014, people that are now inside the administration were involved in staging essentially a coup and removing the government that had been elected and replacing it with a government of their choice. This government is the government that you see now running Ukraine. It was a very anti-Russian clique, very hostile to all things Russian. And that government cooperated closely with us with the goal of ultimately building up enormous military power. And that's what has happened between 2014 and 2022. At the same time, Putin, watching all of this and knowing what was going on, moved to seize Crimea, which historically has been Russian, certainly since 1776. And the problem is that he knew if he didn't seize it, that we would send the United States Navy and the Royal Navy and other navies from NATO to dock in Sevastopol. In other words, to use the Crimean naval facilities for NATO purposes. And again, he and his colleagues have been warning us for decades now not to advance to the borders of Russia, not to push NATO right up against Russia. And Eastern Ukraine is a position from which we could launch missiles and essentially neutralize the Russian nuclear deterrent, the ICBMs that they've got. Russians know that, so they weren't going to tolerate it. So to listen to somebody on the Hill talk about returning crime, yeah, he has nothing, he doesn't know what he's talking about. And again, the population there was always Russian and Tartar.
Well,
it was never Ukrainian. And the same thing is true in Eastern Europe, Eastern Ukraine.
It's scary to think if they know what they're talking about and they're still saying, I hope ignorance. If they actually know the topic, it's so irresponsible. So I want to get your response to this. There's been a lot of internet chatter. We received some emails about this. I don't believe a word of this. So Jake Tapper reports that $3 billion just had an accounting error. And I think the money's being laundered back through someone. I don't trust any of these people. So I want to play this piece of tape and Jake Sullivan's response, and then I'd love your reaction. Play cut 4.
There was this very bizarre admission from the Pentagon this week of an accounting error that suggested that the U.S. has at least $3 billion that it didn't know it had that it can use for Ukraine aid. That's a hell of an accounting error.
Well, one thing I just want to make clear, that is not money that went out the door and disappeared. That is not a waste of that $3 billion. It is simply a tally of how much military equipment we have given them.
Colonel, is there some money laundering going on here or some shenanigans? Because that's quite an accounting error.
Keep in mind, Charlie, that we've been trying for 10 years to audit the Department of Defense. We can't do it. I mean, we just can't tell with any precision how much money has gone in, how much is coming out.
Yep, that's right.
And where most of it goes. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, I think the mafia had better bookkeeping than the Biden.
Well, they had to, because they actually might have been audited by the IRS.
That's right. No, I think your point on laundering is very important. People don't understand that most of the cash never leaves the United States. It just moves from Congress to DOD, from DOD into the various defense contractors' hands, and then finds its way back in the form of lucrative donations to members of the Senate and the House from the industries that are grateful for the squandering of our resources. So there's no doubt that's true. But we should also understand billions of dollars do get through at some point, because we own Ukraine. We pay for the government. We pay for the army. We're paying for the medical bills, everything, you name it. We effectively own the place. And that's another reason that I think the government wants desperately to find some way to retrieve something from the ash heap of history, which is what Ukraine is becoming. So, at the end of the day, you're dealing with more than incompetence. Remember, these are also ideologues. They really believe that we are over there fighting to extend LGBTQRS or whatever it's called to everyone else in the world.
That's
forcing
right.
down Russian throats. We're forcing everything down everyone's throats everywhere, which is why right now the BRICS plus 80 other countries are developing an alternative to our financial system. We're going to see a meeting in St. Petersburg later in June, and the Russians and the Chinese and the Indians and the others are putting together gold-backed currency. They are actually going to conduct transactions in gold, and this is going to put us out of business. This further de-dollarizes the financial system.
You're spot on. Colonel, back in the 15 or 1600s, there used to be conquests to try to spread Christianity. Now there's conquests to spread the gay agenda. And because they really believe, if you ask some of these people, they think it's their moral crusade to put forth, quote, their idea of Western values are not your and I ideas of Western values. It's LGBT, wokeism, gay pride flags, BLM. How much of this conflict is actually an ideological proxy war of wokeism versus whatever they think Russia is?
Well, it's very much that way on one level. And then on the second level, of course, you have BlackRock and all the other major financial institutions in the West who are trying to get control of the resources in Ukraine and would like to see Russia destroyed so that they can steal the resources.
A colonizing project. Okay, so an actual raw material colonization project.
Yeah.
And so American corporations think, well, they look at it no different than the Dutch in Africa. They just are going to try to set up some sort of, corporate model if we're able to control Ukraine as the 51st state effectively.
Oh, absolutely. And remember, the annoying part for them is that all of the critical resources are now under Russian occupation.
So when they say they want to liberate the eastern part of Ukraine, maybe it's more about having rare earth minerals and agricultural advantage than it is actually having people believe in a certain. Should we just think of everything through an ultimately cynical lens? I'm already there, but it sure seems that way.
Well, I think in this case, absolutely, given the fact that in eastern Ukraine, the overwhelming majority of the population there is Russian. It's not just a question of speaking Russian. They're ethnically Russian. Now, they were citizens involuntarily of Ukraine, and they were oppressed as an unwanted minority. Their culture, their religion, everything was being oppressed. That's another reason why the Russians went in there, to relieve the suffering for the Russians in eastern Ukraine. So bottom line is none of this is what it seems to be. Most Americans have no idea. And Charlie, most Americans are right about something. We should not be involved in this. This is not our affair. We understand none of it. We have no ties to the region. And that's one of the things that's very disturbing about this administration. Seems that there are a lot of people in this administration pushing the war agenda for reasons that have nothing to do with our interests, have everything to do with their own, both financial and apparently historical.